Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, depending on where you're joining from. On behalf of the International Elephant Foundation, I want to welcome everyone to today's virtual event on the practicalities of collaring elephants for research and management. My name is Chase Ledoux, IEF Special Projects Manager, and I'll be your moderator for the session. But joining me are my colleagues at IEF. We have Debbie Olson, our Executive Director, and Sarah Conley, our Director of Conservation. Before we begin, a few words on why IEF is hosting this conversation today. Collaring has become one of the most powerful tools available to elephant researchers and managers. It underpins our understanding of movement, habitat use, human-elephant conflict, and increasingly real-time decision-making in the field. But for those who haven't yet deployed a collar or who are considering scaling up an existing program, the gap between we should collar elephants and we have reliable, actionable data flowing in is wide and full of practical decisions that don't make it into the published literature. Hardware choices, veterinary protocols, community engagement, data management, troubleshooting in remote settings, these and many more things are the things that determine whether a collaring program succeeds or stalls. And so that's what today is about. We've brought together two speakers who sit on different but complementary sides of this work, one from the manufacturing and technical design side, and one from the field research and program leadership side. Both work across continents, and together we'll hope they'll give you a grounded, honest picture of what collaring elephants actually involves. Our first speaker is Hadrien Haupt, a wildlife tracking specialist at AWT Africa Wildlife Tracking. He is involved in the design and manufacture of tracking equipment for wild animals. His work supports wildlife research, conservation, wildlife management, zoological institutions, and human-wildlife conflict mitigation projects around the world. Hadrien holds a Bachelor of Science degree and is a qualified Fagasa guide. His background includes working as a field guide and wildlife monitor, providing him with extensive practical experience in wildlife conservation and management. Combining field expertise with technical innovation, he is passionate about developing reliable tracking technologies that help researchers, conservationists, and wildlife managers better understand, protect, and sustainably manage wildlife populations. Our second speaker is Dr. Aung Chan, the Asia Conservation Program Director at the Denver Zoo Conservation Alliance, where he leads field conservation initiatives across Asia. He is also a commissioned member of the IUCN SSC Asian Elephant Specialist Group, and he earned his PhD in fish, wildlife, and conservation biology from Colorado State University and conducted extensive fieldwork in Myanmar, including GPS collar deployments on wild Asian elephants to study their movement patterns and habitat use at the human-wildlands interface. His research has been published in journals including Movement Ecology, Landscape Ecology, Science, and Global Ecology and Conservation, and has been supported by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service Asian Elephant Conservation Fund. So we're very happy to have both of these speakers with us today. A quick word on how the next hour will run. We've reserved 60 minutes total. Our two speakers will each share their perspectives for roughly the first 30 to 40 minutes combined. Hadrien will go first, then Aung will. After which we'll move into about 20 minutes of moderated question and answer. I'll be drawing on questions that we've prepared beforehand, but also that you can submit via the chat. So please don't wait until the end. Go ahead and put the questions in the chat, and we'll be compiling those for our speakers to answer at the end. A few quick notes. Please keep your microphones and cameras muted to try and save some bandwidth during our presentations. If you want to ask a question at the end, you can use the raise hand button or send us a message in the chat, and we'll try to be able to let you speak live with our speakers. This session is being recorded, so all of you will get a link to the recording within a few days. Please give us a few days to send that out, but we'll send it to all the other registrants too who are not able to join us live. So with that, we'll go ahead and get started, and Hadrien, the floor is yours.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Chase, for the introductions and organizing the event, and to the International Elephant Foundation. I think it's very important to keep an open dialogue between practitioners all in the conservation sector. Let me just share my screen and we can get going. I'm going to try to keep the presentation quite brief. The main reason is that we can have more time for the questions at the end of the presentation. Let me just see if this is working. Oof. There we go. Can everyone see my screen?
Yes, perfect.
Okay, why is this not working now? Okay, there we go. Sorry. There we go. So elephant collaring, a practical perspective on technology applications and lessons from the field. So we'll discuss pretty much how collars are used in wildlife tracking and what value they add, what they can't do. And at the end of it, I'll answer any questions that you might have on the topic. So basically, wildlife telemetry is a subfield of wildlife research and management, where researchers use tracking devices to monitor and study the behavior, movements, and interactions of wild animals. This practice is also sometimes referred to as animal tracking or wildlife monitoring. So what is a tracking collar? So to boil it down, a tracking collar is a device that you'll put on an animal to be able to monitor it remotely or to get live feedback from that animal to know where it is. So there's different technology options available in a tracking collar. And this is probably the first place where people often get quite confused, is to try to choose what tracking technology is best for your application. So the technology is broken down into what is currently available. I've put this slide together. So you have VHF telemetry, which is kind of your rudimentary old school tracking. This would be this image in the middle over here where you'll see the person with the receiver on his hip and the antenna up in the sky. And that is VHF tracking. You get live feedback from the collar, but you need to be within range of the collar. The ranges vary depending on topography, vegetation, thickness, and so on, but you're usually getting about 5 to 20 kilometers, depending on the habitat type. In very dense forest environments, you're probably going to get less range, and you're probably going to get about a kilometer range. It's very reliable. The lifespan is very good, and it's your basic go-to. So if your budget doesn't allow, if you're very limited with your collaring operation, I would advise always going for VHF tracking collar as a bare minimum. And then after that, if your budget allows, you can add complexity to that. So for example, adding complexity, you can add a UHF collar, which pretty much allows you to collect GPS data or other sensory data and download that with the UHF transceiver at fairly close ranges within about 100 meters to a kilometer. So you actually have to go find that collar, which you generally do using a VHF, the first technology I discussed. And then with the UHF, you could go download the collar and get GPS data, accelerometer data, or any other data that you are logging on that collar. Then we're going to move towards LoRa. So LoRa is a fantastic technology. It's relatively new speaking. It's about 10 to 15 years old, LoRa technology. For LoRa, you need a terrestrial network. So you would have to put up your own gateways and you'll be able to manage that system yourself. LoRa and Sigfox work in a similar way. The only difference is Sigfox, you do not manage your network. There's usually a company that have put that network up beforehand, and you'd be using your collar data through their backhaul and through their network. Where LoRa, you're managing your own network. There's also some countries like, for example, the Netherlands and some areas in Africa as well, where cell phone companies like Vodacom and MTN have taken it upon themselves to put up their own LoRa networks. So it's a fantastic technology in the sense that it uses a lot less power than satellite, so it's a lot more power efficient, and it transmits very long range. The negative factor is if your elephant moves out of LoRa coverage, you're not going to get data, and there will also be dead spots on any reserve because LoRa works direct line of sight. So pretty much anywhere on the property, if you can see the LoRa gateway or the LoRa antenna, you'll pick it up. Generally, the ranges we're picking up are around 15 to 30 kilometers direct line of sight. So on very hilly areas, it's not ideal, but in open areas like the Masai Mara and open grassland habitat, it's very well suited. And it comes at a huge cost reduction than satellite because LoRa, if you've set up your network, there are no monthly costs, and the tags and technology, the devices, the modems, things like that are a lot cheaper than satellite devices. Then we've got our GSM collars. So GSM collars were really good a few years back when we could rely on 2G connectivity. But unfortunately, with the advent of 4G, 5G, and the later technologies, they're actually phasing out 2G. And most cell phone operators are no longer maintaining 2G infrastructure. So that's caused a bit of a problem for us because you can still make a collar with 2G. It works really well, but we don't know when that sunset will happen. So the collar could actually stop working on that network at any time. So we do not advise using 2G GSM collars. We're hoping in the near future that'll be replaced by NB-IoT, which is narrowband IoT, and this is also something that will be implemented by some cell phone companies. Currently, NB-IoT only has good coverage in areas like the US and Singapore, and a bit of a patchy coverage in Europe. So we're still waiting for them to add that infrastructure to areas where there's elephants like India, Africa, Malaysia, and Indonesia, where it would be a bit more useful for us. Now, I'll speak about EMOSAT before I speak about Iridium. EMOSAT was a very great technology. It was worked really well in dense forest environments. It had very good penetration on the forest environments because it sends at higher power. The modems were bigger and it was power hungry, but it really worked well. The problem with EMOSAT at the moment is it's been decommissioned. So a lot of the satellites are under maintenance and they're decommissioning them. The other issue is that they do not have a small modem anymore. They stopped that. It's become redundant. So we can no longer make EMOSAT collars, but it'll be great if they brought a small modem back in future that would be usable in similar way to Iridium. So the go-to for all elephant tracking devices is Iridium. Most people are using this because they're working in remote areas with no connectivity, and the elephants are often covering great distances. They're not fenced in, so they can move between properties, move between countries, and it's the only way you can successfully keep track of an elephant, because Iridium has global coverage. You can pick it up anywhere in the world, you will get coverage. And what's also great about Iridium, it's near real time. So if you get an alarm or GPS from your collar, you can get that position within a couple of seconds of the actual data being recorded on the elephant. So that's fantastic. A lot of people call it real time, but because of data latencies over the networks and through the backhaul, there is still a latency. So we prefer to refer to it in technical term of near real time. Okay. The other satellite technologies that are available is Globalstar. Globalstar is very nice as well. It's also a LEO, so low Earth orbiting satellite system. The negative of Globalstar is it's simplex, so you cannot send commands to a Globalstar device. So for example, if your collar is deployed with a Globalstar unit and it's set to every 3 hours and your elephant leaves the reserve or starts raiding crops, you cannot send it a message over the satellite link to go to 10 minutes. The collar stays on that interval. You cannot change it. So you don't have as much freedom and versatility as you do with Iridium. Then the other one is Argus. Argus is also great, but it's mainly used in the marine sector. It's starting to be used more on terrestrial animals, and there is definitely a future to potentially use Argus for elephant tracking and so on. We're still busy testing the penetration and coverage in dense forest environments, but it does tend to be lacking because it's a low power satellite system. But it's something to keep working on and keep your eyes out on. So perhaps in future, we might start working with Argus to make units for elephants with them. Okay. So the basic components of an elephant collar, those were the different technologies I just covered, then the components. So pretty much an elephant collar has these basic components inside it. And this all together is what makes it work. So you can see it's quite a complex array of things inside it. And this is why you can sometimes have technical issues and components can failure, and you can sometimes have issues with your collars. We'll be discussing the issues you can face with collars as well a little bit later. But pretty much it boils down to you have an array of antennas in a collar, which is very difficult because all antennas can interfere with one another, and that interference can cause problems down the line. So your GPS patch antenna would generally be at the top of the collar, along with your Iridium patch antenna. These are tuned to work really well in the wildlife environment and to try get data as accurately as possible. The negative side effect of a patch antenna is it needs a good orientation. It needs a good sky view. So if your collar is skew or rotates on the elephant's back, you will no longer pick up that signal. So that is one of the negative drawbacks of a patch antenna. Then you've got your VHF whip antenna. The whip antenna is generally in the collar's belting. Then you've got your electronic modules. So these are your processors, your data storage, your memory, all of that inside the collar. You've got your sensor modules. So the sensor module will have your gyro, your accelerometer, your temperature sensors. You can have your audio loggers. You can add a lot of different sensors to a collar. But just keep in mind, every single sensor you add to a collar adds a level of complexity to the design of the collar. And all of these complex things, they have a breaking point. So it can take away from the reliability of the collar. So any sensor or any complexity you add to any tracking system or any field operative device, you must be quite cautious, because that can always take away from your reliability. And if your main objective is to get GPS data from a collar, you could distract from that, because the collar could have issues by adding too many sensors. They also use more power, so it can reduce the lifespan of your collar, for example. Then you've got the Iridium satellite modem, or the LoRa modem, or the GSM modem. So you've got your different transmission modem inside the collar. Then we recently added Bluetooth to the collars as well. This just makes it easy to interface with the collar at close ranges with a cell phone or another device. Then you've got lots of batteries. So fortunately for satellite collars on elephants, we're not limited like pangolins or smaller cat species or things like that. We have a lot of place on elephant collars. The collar size is not a limiting factor. Elephant collars can go quite big, and we found that they have very little to no effect on the elephants as well. So we can put a lot of batteries in there. We're generally putting around 12 D-cell batteries inside an elephant collar. So that can get us quite a good lifespan. Currently, the lifespan of collars isn't dictated by the batteries. It's actually dictated by the wear and tear of the elephant collar, and the belting is breaking before the batteries are flat. To make a collar robust and hard enough to last well on an elephant, I think that's the biggest challenge, because they're very abrasive and they live in very harsh environments, as you all know. Okay, so the fitment diagram. So this is just a quick diagram to show you how you would fit a collar to an elephant. You have your top unit at the top, which will have your antennas, and then at the bottom, we generally have a lead weight. You might ask why we don't put batteries or electronics in the bottom. The main reason is because of the size of the elephant, you have a lot of current drop if you run cables in the belting. These cables in the belting also break. So it proved to be the most successful design for an elephant collar is to have all your electronics in one place at the top and have a counterweight at the bottom that keeps the collar orientated the right direction to be able to transmit data via GPS and satellite. Then this is just how you would generally fit a lead weight. You would have numbers on the belting, so you can line it up to ensure the collar is fitted straight on the animal. And then you'll have other options as well, such as a drop-off. This is fairly new, where you can put a drop-off device on the elephant collar. So it's often not needed because, as I said, the wear and tear on elephant collars is quite high. We're finding on average an elephant collar will last around 4 years on the animal. We have had elephant collars lasting 10 years, but these are rare occasions, and it all depends on the animal behavior. For example, if you collar dominant bulls that are fighting a lot and they're in a dense forest environment, we tend to see collars lasting more around the 2-year lifespan. So it really depends on the animal's behavior, the conditions, and the collar fit is how long the collar will last. Drop-offs are great if you're putting loggers or you know the duration of the project. If you only want to get data on movements of elephants in the area for, say, 2 years, you can put a drop-off, and that saves you a lot of cost at the end of the project, because you don't need helicopters, vets, and capture teams to go out and remove the collars. You can just wait for the time to come to tick on, and then the drop-off will drop off on the set pre-programmed date and time that you set. We're busy working on a way to make a drop-off remotely droppable as well, but the main objective initially was to keep it robust enough so it doesn't fail on the elephant, because if you're relying on a drop-off, you have to be certain that collar will drop off. Okay, so what is the ideal collar fit on an adult African and Indian elephant? So you can see on the left-hand side here, we have an Indian elephant with a very well-fitted collar. And on the right-hand side, we have an African elephant. So both of these collars are fitted fairly well. You can see the collar fit is very tight. The tight-fitting collar is advised because it irritates the animal less. It doesn't move around as much when the animal's walking, and there's less chance of the collar rotating on the animal's neck and creating issues down the line. We'll talk about collars rotating a bit further. I have a few slides that show how that would look and what you can do about that. So in general, on adult animals, we always advise fitting a collar tight. You can have one fist, and as you see on this Indian elephant on the left, there's not even a gap underneath the collar. But you can see it's not cutting into the neck. It's actually fitting that animal very well. And generally what will happen on Indian elephants, you can fit the collars tighter because they generally fitted while the animals are still standing, or Indonesian or Malaysian elephants, because they trap the elephant between two other elephants and they can actually do the collaring operation while the elephant is awake and standing. On African elephants, we generally dart them from helicopter, and it's not possible to fit the collar while the animal's upright. So it's actually quite challenging to lift the animal's head or to pull the collar strap underneath the elephant's head. This is generally done by metal wire that you would tie to one end of the collar, and you would pull it underneath the animal's neck, making sure that there's no twists when fitting the collar, and making sure that the belting numbers are aligned on either side so the collar fits straight. Okay, why do we collar elephants? A collar is a tool. It's not a conservation outcome. So that's one thing we need to keep very close to our hearts and remember. A collar isn't going to stop poaching. It's not going to stop human-wildlife conflict. It's just a tool to help inform decisions on that. So what management questions are you trying to answer is the first thing you should ask before even ever trying to fit a collar to an animal. Where are elephants moving? Are examples of some management questions. What corridors are being used? Where does human-elephant conflict occur? Are mitigation measures working? How large is the area being used by a population? Are translocated elephants settling successfully? Is the environment recovering after is the elephant recovering after a medical intervention? Without clear questions, collar data often becomes expensive information with limited conservation value. So once fitting a collar, we need to try add as much value as possible from the information we're getting. So what collars can tell us and what they cannot tell us. So collars can inform us about movement patterns, home range, seasonal habitat use, corridor identification, conflict hotspots, response to interventions, transboundary movements. What collars cannot tell us is the population size of the animals, the population trends, where they're moving, what are they actually doing. You need physical human observations to do that. Cause of every mortality, health status of all elephants, behavior of uncollared animals, complete ecosystem understanding. It's important, a few collared animals does not represent every elephant. And at the bottom here, I just did a bit of a flow diagram to explain what an elephant collar and collaring and action might look like. So you need to detect the problem. So GPS data showing elephants frequently entering farms at night. This is often seen in areas in Indonesia and Malaysia where the animals go crop raiding at night. So you need to analyze the movements. We identify movement routes and conflict hotspots from the data. You can plan solutions. We work with communities to design targeted interventions focusing on key areas. We install solutions like beehive fences, chili fences, early warning systems or lights. We monitor the response. We track elephants' movements changing after the intervention using GPS data. We adapt and improve. We refine the strategies and continue working with the communities for long-term coexistence. Better data, better decisions, better coexistence. GPS collars provide the information we need to make smarter, faster conservation decisions. Okay. So here are some of the issues with collars. So here we can see photos. If some of you have fitted collars before, you might have seen this. And you can see this was a study done by Brooke Filswald in the Addo area in South Africa. And the project suffered a huge rate of elephant collars twisting. And what was strange is it was uncomparable to similar studies in other areas. And you can see here the collars were twisting on the elephant's necks. Initially, we thought the collars were fitted too loose, which wasn't the case. Once we worked closely with the vets and stuff, we saw the fitment was actually perfect. And it turned out that these elephants were just prone to twisting collars based on the vegetation, and they had learned how to do that. Unfortunately, these animals couldn't be recollared because the twists were hurting the animals. And by the end of the study, it was decided that to rather not collar these individuals and rather collar other individuals, like females that had a lower rate of twisting the collars. So sometimes you need to adapt. You can have a whole project outline planned and the reality kicks in and some things don't work and you need to adapt the plan to try and make it work. Over here, we tried changing the collar design and unfortunately all the interventions we did not work and these collars kept twisting on those individuals. They even recollared the same animal with different collars and he kept twisting the belts. So at the end, it was advised to not collar these individuals and select other individuals from that population to collar. Over here, you can see an elephant collar that's broken off the elephant. So you can see the belting is broken here. This can happen if bulls fight, for example, or if elephants are collared in crates or kept in bomas where there's man-made structures. They can hook the collar on these fences or on trees and they can actually rip the collar off. Elephants are extremely strong. They can weigh up to 6 tons. and they can definitely break a collar if they want to get it off. They can generally get it off. Over here, you can see the wear and tear on a collar, for example. Wear and tear is excessive. It can wear straight through stainless steel plates, for example, because of the sand on the skin and the very rough skin. So you can see an elephant collar after a few years. I think this collar was fitted for around 4 years. And you can see how this collar's wear and tear is after that period of time. And eventually it actually fell off the collar. Other issues and problems when collaring elephants is mud. No GPS and no satellite system can send through mud or water. So that's also why you have very limited collar connectivity in dense forest environments. So for example, if this vegetation and so on was on the collar, it could affect its GPS and satellite antenna, and then you wouldn't get as good signal as you would have hoped for. So mud tends to be a problem. Generally, mud will dry and fall off a collar, and you'll only lose signal for a couple of hours. But if you do see signal not coming up, it's always good to follow up on that elephant, take the VHF, go look for the elephant, see what the issue is. Perhaps the collar is twisted, perhaps it's mud, perhaps the collar is rotated on the elephant's neck, and then you can contact us or any manufacturer and we can advise what the next steps would be. Other issues that affect satellite collars is called the canyon effect. So pretty much your satellites are moving in the low Earth orbit around the Earth. And if you have deep canyons or high forests, that can block the satellite view, and then you will not get satellite transmission from the collar. What will happen in this instance, the collar will be logged on the collar, the data will be logged on the collar, and this data will be caught up at the later stage. So over here, you also see a little infograph that shows you how the satellite coverage needs to be. It needs to be open, clear line of sight for this Iridium satellite to pick up well. If you have canyons or high topography or drainage lines or things like that, the collar will not pick up and coverage will be poor. Also, you can see if satellite coverage is poor, there's another negative side effect. The collar's lifespan will be very poor because the battery uses more power to try and get the data through. Okay, so the takeaway from this session was pretty much data and collars alone do not conserve elephants. Informed decisions and actions do. And that's where we rely on our partners. We rely on all the NGOs and all the government organizations that are working with our collars to kind of inform those decisions and take action on the collar data that is provided. We also rely on you to help us design collars that are going to help answer the questions you need answered. Thank you. And we won't do the questions immediately. We'll wait for Ang's session to finish, and then we can answer questions together maybe. Thank you very much, everyone.
Thanks so much, Hadrien. So informative. And like he said, go ahead and keep putting your questions in the chat. And after Aung's presentation, we'll try to get to them. So Aung, it is your chance to share your work.
Can you see my screen? Good. Yep. Okay. Well, first of all, thank you, Chase, and IEF for inviting me, and Adrian's wonderful presentation on the background of the collars and how the technology works. And for me, I wanted to get a little bit into if the slide would go, a little bit of field experience that I had in Myanmar. What the data looks like, some of the cleaning consideration that you should be considering once you have the collars deployed, question that we ask, and some of the lessons and examples that we learned from the field, and with some limitation and concluding thoughts. I don't have as much slides so that I can give you guys, plenty of time for questions, and I'm sure you'll have a lot of questions coming up in the chat as well. So first off, this is the work that I did before I joined this position with Denver Zoo Conservation Alliance, and I wouldn't been able to do this. It wasn't an individual effort, especially thanks to Smithsonian and Myanmar Timber Enterprise, who provided vets, field staff, and wonderful staff to do the collaring with plenty of experience, and in both international and in-country partners to make this work possible. First off, on the right-hand side, this is where my field site was. It's in Myanmar. We had 3 sites across the country, and we put about 45 GPS collars on the elephants, and the one on the top left is the very first elephant that I collared as a professional, and it decided to land knee deep in the mud. So that's one of the consideration. And like in Asian elephants, like for where most of my sites is, we were on foot to dart them, so that presents some of the field like technical like difficulties, and we were only able to collar about 5 to like 7 per field season, which span about 2 to 3 months. So just keep those in mind, and when you're putting those numbers like, oh, we're gonna collar 40 elephants this field season, probably not going to happen unless you have a huge teams going on. And what I wanted to stress is like in Myanmar, we collaborating with government partners, and that's going to vary country by country. So please make sure you check what are the requirements are for your specific countries, and the field logistics of those are a very important considerations, and having a protocol on like when things goes wrong. Having those backup plans are a very important considerations to have moving forward with this endeavor. So let's say we have put collars on elephants, and I'm going to play this. This is an actual GPS collar tract from one of the elephants in Myanmar that we collared. You can look at those birds going. But on the left hand side, this is what you will probably likely see, UTM east or north, depend if you convert to UTM, or it'll be flat and long. And you'll have some sort of time stamp. And DOP is a delusion of precision, which is a measure of, I guess, the quality of your fix at that point. So for this collar particularly, it provides DOP, so the lower the value is better. And this is like a mock data, and if your DOP is high, there's a paper in 2010 in Roy Publishing by Freyer that did a lot of the reviews on like how to process and clean these data. And if your uncertainty is high, maybe you shouldn't use for some analysis. And in GPS, it's not always, like not always reliable, depending on how many satellites you have for that particular fix. So always visualize your data, meaning, plot them out on a landscape. So let's say, at 2 p.m. it's at some point, and if you plot it out and if you calculate the distance, this is probably close together, but if you calculate a distance and say it's an elephant, but it's 20 kilometers apart and within 2 hours, that fix is probably not likely. So you have to pay attention to those, like those bounces and uncertain or low resolution fixes in the data. Let's see. And so once you have these data, like the framing of your questions should focus around, what you have is this movement path. In the Khan movement ecology in 2008, like they laid it out nicely. And most of us in conservation world, we are interested in this external factors part, and to some degree navigation capacity of how this external factors influences the movement path that we observe. So keep that in mind, but these are the 4 components that can be, describing or underlaying 4 components for your movement path that you see from the data. And for some of the examples of the questions that we asked for the Asian elephants in Myanmar, these are, mock graphs or don't. And like one of the things that you can ask is like space use. So how much space, like a home range, seasonal range, monthly range, those sort of stuff, and like utilizing distribution, how much of those that individual elephants are using, you can fit a bunch of different models. There's a lot of rich literature on this, and so you'll have to make that decision. You can ask space use related questions, resource selection. So are they selecting for, let's say, sugarcane more, or in certain landscape, what are the driving factors behind it, which is a functional response, right? If it's like a sugarcane field, are they, selecting for it? Does the selecting of sugarcane changes based on the availability, or does the selection of sugarcane changes depending on how much agriculture is available within their home range? That sort of questions that we wanted to know in Myanmar, because there was not much data looking into those types of questions. And one of the unexpected things that we uncovered, outside of those like ecology elephant questions, is our elephants were getting poached for skin. And so we had to work with the government, form some rangers patrol teams, and set up those I guess more rigorous patrolling and active conservation efforts within the landscape, at least where we were working. And it seems to die down towards the end of our field efforts. But like the first couple of years, it was pretty brutal. And we got a few of the papers, and I was working on some elephants in Namibia as well. So like I just wanted to share, like, these are like sort of the questions and framing that you can have with these sort of data. And in Myanmar, what we found was there was a lot of individual variation. I saw one of the questions in the chat asking, if you can color an elephant for a few elephants and have a population description. And what we found was like the selection coefficients for our population, at least, was all over the place. And if you looked at the population mean, it sits right in the middle. But there's a lot of stories within the individual's variation. And this is found both in Asian elephants and in African elephants. There's a lot of study through George Wittermeyer and Guillaume Bastille-Rousseau. That group has, published a bunch of stuff on how like individual variation is driving the movement behavior resource use on the landscape. So like I will be cautious on making an inference to a population's level, really depending on how much samples you have. And so the key takeaway is what we found is both composition and configuration of agriculture is driving the range size in our sites in Myanmar. And depending on like how fragmented with the agriculture and natural vegetation is on the landscape, they're more likely to be using or selecting for ag in those like very fragmented landscapes. So ultimately we can draw an inference that could create a tension between human and elephants and potentially increase human-elephant conflict. And we can map those out spatially from these data as well. And I want to end on this, like some of the conservation questions that you might be able to answer from GPS collar is, obviously space use. We did some, connectivity modeling between a national park and a surrounding conservancy area in Namibia. We only use empirical data. We didn't do simulation because they have around, if I'm remembering correctly, about 80 elephants tracked over a long time, and it was a pretty good empirical data, so we were able to lean on that part. And I think Adrian mentioned some along the line of the like before and after study, after release, like what are they doing, or is there a particular treatment like fencing before you put up the fence, how the elephant's moving on the landscape, but after you put the fence down, how that movement behavior changes is very useful in those types of study, habitat selection, and monitoring in general. This data can inform your monitoring team on like how to structure those routes and have a adaptive framework of like adapting your monitoring routes based on where the elephants are or whatnot. You can actually learn like if you have a larger landscape, how the elephants are shifting based on activity. Let's say you're in a national park, community area, or management area. Are they shifting their use pattern to like water or whatnot? Diurnal, like with the time temporally, are they using more water at night at those where they're closer to the communities? So you can learn a lot about those patterns of like elephant behavior and migration timing. Or you probably remember in that animation that I made, like that elephant did one of the like big looping foray events. So those are pretty important if you're thinking about disease transmission, or if you're blending into those sort of like One Health approach and disease ecology with movement ecology. And obviously, if we are thinking about reintroduction and whatnot, GPS is one of the important tools, and we should monitor the released animals very closely, whatnot. And some limitations, Hadrien stressed this is not, this is just a tool, and the questions should come from human. And the trade-off is, it can be costly. Putting in a collar on an elephant takes a lot of labor. The drugs are expensive, the logistics are very expensive, and afterwards, you have to have a staff capacity and to see it through, and to have enough sample size for the questions that you may have. It could add up quite quickly. And this is like a less of a problem with elephants, because these collars can last a long time, 4 or 5 years, depending on how you set your fixed rates and how you transmit back if it's a GPS collar. But this is one of the things that you should consider, right? Like, and it all relates back to your questions of like, okay, if we want to see elephants like interacting with a few farms, if you have a fixed rate, which is, how long between the individual locations, if you have it set for every 24 hours, that might not answer your questions that effectively. And accounting for that uncertainty, right? This is a device. It's a measurement device, so it has a measurement error associated with it, and treating that down the road with your analysis and your inference. And when making conservation decisions, you should be aware of that uncertainty involved. And like I said, it can be difficult to scale out of individual level inference. Even like as a whole, like what population doing if you only have 5 and your elephants population is over 1,000, that might not be great inference. And some concluding thoughts, like this tool can provide very interesting answer very interesting questions and insight into ecology. It's not just elephants but different species, but this is not a panacea for all the conservation problems. And I would stress again that your sampling design, like you should think through, like connect what your sampling design, what sort of individuals you're going for based on your questions. And with that, I would be happy to take any questions that have been coming in. This is my email. Feel free to reach out to me, and happy to have a conversation with you guys.
Excellent. Thanks so much, Aung. certainly fascinating and a lot to consider about what you do once the elephant is collared with all of the data. So we have a lot of questions coming in. We're sorting through those now and trying to get to the ones that are most salient and we think would be of greatest use to the rest of the group. I'll go ahead and start off with sort of where Aung left off. If both Aung and Hadrien, if you could answer the question or speak to how collaring has really transitioned from just a research output to answer scientific questions to being part really an operational tool that conservationists can use to manage elephants more or less in real time, including things like early warning systems, conflict mitigation, anti-poaching. So where do you see the most impactful applications of collaring happening right now, and what sort of considerations do those applications require?
I can go for I think you mentioned a pretty interesting tool is the early warning system, and that's ties back to what, you know, who you have collared in the system. And if you're missing, like most people that works long enough in the system knows there's some trouble at elephants that's like to cause problems a lot. If you have them, great, but you have to be upfront about with the community that this is not 100% solution, right? If you the once you have those like problem, quote unquote problem elephants collared, there's no guarantee that the uh, the other elephants won't come in and cooperate or whatnot. So I think like that's tying back to the what you have sample versus what your application, what's your expectation. Those have to line up. And for me, like the most impactful one is like I think we're testing some of these right now, like combining proximity sensor with the GPS collars. I know like some of my group, not my group, my professor's group, is testing some gunshot collars and whatnot. So I think there's a lot of like exciting and development happening in this arena, pairing GPS information with other sensors on board. With elephants, we're lucky enough so that they can carry a lot of the stuff, so we can do it. But it's an interesting time, but with just GPS information alone, it could be limiting.
Hadrien, do you have any further insight to provide?
Yeah, so I'd say initially, I mean, obviously, as a manufacturer, you can see the trends of who's ordering collars over the years. So initially, a lot of the collars were ordered by researchers. It was universities paying for collars for master's students, for doctorates, for projects, pretty much to figure out more about the ecology, the behavior of elephants. And definitely in the last, I'd say probably 5 to 10 years, the shift has been for more government organizations getting involved, a lot of NGOs that are trying to address human wildlife conflict. As the habitat of elephants is shrinking and humans are encroaching on it, it's an obvious problem that needs to be addressed. And collars are one of the tools that are being used to address this. But as I say, I mean, an elephant collar, you can fit it to the problem animal, you can get the alert. If you don't have a competent team to go and do an intervention on that behavior and to do something about it, it doesn't help, because also communities and stuff quickly lose faith in a system if they see a collared animal raiding their crops. They don't understand why that's happening because they assume that someone could have intervened there. The reality is also, for example, if you have a collar on an elephant and it's been poached somewhere remote, people also assume you can know straight away, okay, what's happened, go catch the poachers. A lot of these areas are inaccessible. So you see the data, and to physically get someone to go out there and react takes 12 to 24 hours to get a helicopter, to maybe get in a car and drive there. It can be very remote and very difficult to get to. In some areas, it's mountainous. You got to go on foot. And you actually, even sometimes when we get a mortality signal, for example, on an elephant, sometimes it's taking up to a week to get someone out there to actually go see what's happened. In a week's time, the tusks are gone. Like Aung said, the skin's been harvested, different parts have been taken, and the criminals are likely gone. So all of this needs to work together. It doesn't help that an elephant gives us an immediate alert to a geofence or to a mortality alert or something, but you don't have the response time on the ground, or you don't have the capacity on the ground to take action on that. And I think that's where it boils down to. The kind of theme of the collaring talk that was given is, without the management and the action behind the collaring. Collaring is just a tool. You can have a cell phone. If you can't use it, it doesn't serve much purpose. So we also like to keep a dialogue open, myself and all the, I mean, there's many manufacturing companies out there making collars, to keep a dialogue open between us and the people using the collars, because we can help innovate. We can help as much as we can to try close that gap and to give the information that you can take action on.
I think that's a very good
Thanks.
point. Yeah, and something that teams should plan and budget for is all of the things that go along with actually using the information that's coming from the collars. I think it's useful if we use the remaining time to just sort of step through the process, both from applying the collar, then reading the data, and then looking forward. So we've got a lot of questions about whether collaring has impacts on elephants, both I think on the individual animal, but maybe over long term too. So if either or both of you could speak to whether or not there are side effects from collaring or any harmful effects, how much does the collar weigh, and what are some of the most common errors you see during the collaring process? I think, Hadrien, you spoke a little bit about this.
Yeah, so I mean, the collar, we found the neck mounted collar is definitely the least, the least, it affects the elephant the least, but obviously you need to plan for that accordingly. So for example, the case study I showed there of Brooke, where her collars were rotating on the elephant's neck, that project came at a huge additional cost because they had to intervene and remove those collars. So all of a sudden your helicopter time's increasing, the vet hours are increasing, the project becomes a lot more expensive. And it's something that you should always cater for. If you decide to put a collar on an animal, you must have the capacity to take it off and intervene. A collaring shouldn't be done lightheartedness. It should be an ultimate last resort. You should really have a good reason to put a collar on. As a manufacturer, I should be pushing to put collars on, but it's the opposite actually. I hate seeing an animal with a collar on. Ideally, if we all did our work correctly and we got to the stage we wanted to be, we would no longer see animals with collars, and the need to collar them wouldn't be there because they could live happy lives in enough habitat, and we could mitigate human-wildlife conflict in other ways. But unfortunately, it is a tool, and we're dealing with real-world problems that need to be addressed. So issues can definitely arise. So for example, I did speak about the mud. You can have electronic component failures. Like all electronics are fragile. They're on in very harsh environments. Collars can fail, and then you need to mitigate that. You need to remove the collar. You need to intervene. So it's always good to plan that from the beginning of a project and have kind of an emergency fund for that. So if you have to remove collars earlier, you can. And also to be open and to work with the manufacturers. Tell them when you have problems. Don't hide it. Often projects, especially NGOs, they don't want to publicize failures. But I think failures are good to learn from. And I think we all need to be a lot less reserved and discuss failures openly with each other so we can learn from it and we can move forward. Issues that Africa Wildlife Trafficking is having, for example, could help other manufacturers resolve their issues. And we could all move forward to having better products out there that can be fitted to collars, or fitted to elephants. So, yeah, I think collaboration is important and keeping an open dialogue.
Great. And sort of speaking to that collaboration and open dialogue, we broached the topic of community engagement and making sure governments and local officials are sort of in on the process when permits are required. I think, Aung, you can speak to this too, is how important is community engagement when you're carrying out a collaring operation? Hadrien, you spoke to the fact that some community members may be upset when they see a collared elephant raiding crops or something like that. What does that sort of look like? How do you engage communities to ensure they understand what's going on and the practical limitations, but also the promises of a collaring operation?
It's really important. I can share this story. It's sad and funny at the same time. Where in one of the communities that we before we call, we always, try to visit the villagers in the surrounding areas, talk to them, and like let them know, show them photos of what we're doing, what we're trying to achieve, and so that they don't, freak out with, men with guns running through the village, first off, and have that buy-in and have that understanding and being able to connect at a human level. And, for me, I personally interested in seeing what their struggles are and whatnot. But one of the villagers, like after we collared, I revisited about a couple weeks, and he was kind of suggesting that our collars made the elephant like mad, and hinting at like destroying the crops, his crops or whatnot. And I was like, oh yeah, like can I, go see, and like can you show me where the damage was? I've seen tracks, but like it was not like that ran through the whole track. It didn't destroy any houses, and I think there's like that buy-in of like if you I think that community was a very new one, that we went in. We didn't have that relationship of trust, when we went and collared. Probably on my part is a fault, but having that tension, and like you can like easily that situation, if the elephant were to ran through the house, or if it probably wouldn't have been another, elephants, or not the collar ones. um the blame can easily land back to you. So having that community engagement part, I think it's, if I were to do it again, I would have, a lot of more visits, having building that communication before I went in, for that particular video. So it's one of the lessons that I learned.
Great. Yeah, I think it just speaks to how much context and planning is required because collaring is not as simple as putting a collar on an elephant and getting data back. I mean, you spoke to the data side of what we get on the back end, but then the front end part, the planning is crucial beyond just getting vets together and figuring out what equipment you need and everything like that. And certainly that deserves a whole nother presentation about preparing for collaring elephants. Given that we are over time, I'd like to end with maybe just a couple more thoughts from our presenters before we keep them any longer. Again, we see all the questions coming through in the chat, and we wish we could get to them all. I'm going to put both of our presenters' email addresses in the chat, so you can feel free to reach out to them, or you can send IEF your questions, and we can sort of parse through those and send them to our presenters too. But to end with, I'd like if both of you could share one piece of advice with people who haven't collared elephants before but are considering implementing collars to help with elephant conservation. What piece of advice would you give them?
I think for me,
Go for
it's,
it,
sorry, for me is having that defined objective of what you're trying to achieve with the collaring. Like, does that make sense? I think that involves having an honest conversation among your colleagues and, the community that you're trying to serve. But like sketching those out and making sure that makes sense for you to collar it, um, do proceed with the calling. I think it's a key part. And if that checks out, logistics and community building, um, like feel free to reach out to the community. I think elephant community is, willing to help and um, work collaboratively in that sort of way. So if you feel like you don't have expertise in this area, like feel free to reach out. Chase, like IEF is a good resource to have, and there's a few others too. So that would be my advice.
Yeah, so I'd almost piggyback on Aung there. I'd say the most important things is to use people with experience in that field. So use vets, use helicopter pilots, use people that have caught elephants before, because a lot of people, when they're starting a project, they'll use a whole new team and if they lack experience, the learning curve is harsh and it ends up costing you a lot more money for your operation. And also, as Aung said, the questions you're asking are very crucial. I'd also advise, before ordering the collar and before going ahead with the collaring, contact a wildlife manufacturer that makes collars and see that the collars are going to answer your questions. See, is GPS data enough, or do you want accelerometer data? Do you need other sensors added to the collar to answer your questions? And if it's for mitigation purposes alone, great, you can get the geofence alert from the collar, you can get mortality signals and things like that. But do you actually have the capacity to take action on that? Do you have resources? Can you send rangers out? Can you send people out to actually take action on those issues? Because often people are fitting collars and it's the first step. It's the fun, it's the easy part, is fitting the collar. I think Aung can probably highlight, like when he did his field work, fitting the collars was probably the funnest aspect. And then afterwards, it's still interesting, but I don't think it's as fun and as challenging as fitting the collar to the actual animal. So with all the fun work comes a lot of hard work behind it that's often not seen. And that's the data analysis and that's the decision-making process behind that. So I think that's kind of the most crucial part of it. But yeah, my takeaway would be definitely work of experience. So rely on experienced veterinarians. The animal safety is the utmost importance. So you in charge of the animal safety. There should be no risk factor there. That animal safety is number one. If you think the collar is going to hurt the animal, if you think the animal's gone down funny and you need to wake it up immediately, take those decisions. Animal safety comes first, and then the project comes second, and you kind of work around that.
Sorry about that. That is great advice, and thank you both for taking the time to share your experience. And thank you all for staying with us for the past hour, despite some technical issues in the beginning. I've been taking notes diligently here. We're so lucky to have Hadrien and Aung as experts in the field to share their wisdom, and I think it boils down to a few points that I'd like to share with everyone before we close. First is, as we said over and over, collars are a tool, not a strategy. And so both speakers reminded us that the decision to collar should follow from a clearly articulated question or a management need, and not just because you want to collar an elephant. The hardware matters, and the surrounding system maybe even matters more. So things like veterinary capacity, community engagement, data pipelines, and long-term staffing capacity determine whether deployment becomes a program or just a one-off effort. Honest planning beats optimistic planning. Timelines stretch, collars fail, animals move in ways you don't anticipate, and so the programs that succeed are the ones that budget time, money, and contingency for the realities of working in the field. And I think all of us in elephant conservation are very familiar and experienced with dealing with contingency plans around elephants. And I think Hadrien's last piece of advice speaks to this most, is the community working on elephant conservation, including via collaring, is global and collaborative. So please look at people who are experienced in the field and ask questions before you just go out into the field and try and reinvent the wheel, so to speak. So to our speakers, thank you so much for sharing the kind of detail that isn't possible to get from reading a scientific paper or a blog post or a news article. This sort of firsthand real-world experience is so valuable to our community, and I'm sure with the amount of questions and interest we've had in this topic, we're probably going to have a follow-up session that focuses more deeply on each of the topics that were just discussed today. And to our attendees, over 250 people have you registered from over 40 countries, most of which coming from Africa and Asia. And so this reach reflects how much this topic matters and how much hunger there is for more information to make meaningful differences for the elephants across the world. A few housekeeping items, as we've been replying in the chat, and as we said at the beginning, a recording of this presentation will be made available to all of you within a few days, so check your inbox for that link. That will be coming soon. This is just one of a series of seminars about elephant conservation and management related topics. We had one on beehive fences a few months ago. Before that, we've had resources related to grant writing and reporting. So please check our website for those recordings and keep an eye out for future topics that we'll be sure to distribute to you as they come along. If you'd like to stay connected with the IEF, please visit our website and social media. We have a grants program whose deadline is coming up in early August, so be sure to check our website if you're interested in applying for funding for IEF. Thank you all once again for joining us this morning. We look forward to staying connected. Travel safely, work well, and we'll see you at the next workshop. Thanks, everyone.